G'day, mate. I know, right? The accent. Um, so it's quite a unique accent around here, apparently. So I'm going to give the audience the opportunity to answer the following question. Where does my accent come from? Kind of. Norway. Kind of as well. Anyone else? Zimbabwe? No, not really. It's not from the UK, no. Unless you know me very well, it's going to be quite a difficult task for you to decipher where this accent comes from. So I'll explain. Step one, you get a Korean kid about that tall, let's say. Let's move him to a random country, let's say Australia for step two. And then step three, let's move him to another random country. Which country should we move him to, dear audience? South Africa? No. Anybody else? Yes, we move him to Norway for a few years, somebody who knows me, and then move him back to an international school in Korea and see what happens to his accent, apparently, and voila. So that's where my accent comes from, this magnificent, brilliant accent, which nobody here seems to be able to understand. So I'll do my best to talk in this American accent and see what happens, but no, very uncomfortable accent. Anyway. I know my life's journey is quite special, but I know it's not that special because I've met so many my age who've had so many more exotic, so many more interesting cultural experiences. Having moved from international school to international school, I've met so many who have their parents' culture and the culture in which they were raised, but they do not identify with either, or perhaps more accurately, they identify so strongly with both that it's basically impossible for them to choose which one. They are third culture kids. They are those who have their own distinct islands of cultures. They have been brought up in one way, in a sense, and their parents have been brought up in another way, and they have to harmonize these two, and it is a very difficult task for them. And I know there are many of you out in the audience today who are third culture kids. How they speak, what they do, what they believe are not what they were brought up to believe, nor what their parents were brought up to believe, but are rather their own little islands of culture. They have their own way of thinking, their own little rituals, and for better or for worse, their own accents. So today I'd like to be talking to you about three main things about the third culture kid. Firstly, the importance of experience. Secondly, about why the third culture kid is so relevant in a dynamic and globalizing 21st century world. And finally, about how the third culture kid overcomes the tragedy of having to leave everything behind and move to another place. So first and foremost, I would like to ask a question for the audience to ponder, not to answer, just to ponder. If a particular person were to have been born in one country and have lived their entire childhoods, their entire lives in another country, which country is it that they truly belong to? In other words, does culture come from experience, or does it come from ethnicity? And this is a difficult question, and as with all difficult questions, what do we do with them? We procrastinate. If there's one thing #IAB promotes, it's procrastinating on difficult questions. And I'm guilty of this myself as well. But I think that it's not a question that can be avoided. It's an inevitable question that always lingers. Where do you belong to? Everybody asks. Are you Korean or are you Australian? Or are you Norwegian? Some even ask. When I asked students from international schools this question, does culture come from ethnicity or experience? They overwhelmingly answered that it was experience that defines who they are. But by contrast, when I asked non-international school students the same question, they suggested that it was their nationalities that defines who they are. So I think this is what distinguishes third culture kids from other individuals. They're somewhat more free from the shackles of nationality. But A question that's perhaps more important to you, dear audience, is why should you care? Why are third culture kids important? And I would argue precisely that in an interconnected and globalizing world, third culture kids are more vital than ever. You know that cliche you hear when you hear the word globalization? The internet, the social media, and for you nerds out there, books. But I would argue precisely that by looking at Nelson Mandela's quote, speak to a man in his second language, get to his brain, speak in his mother tongue, get to his heart. I would argue precisely what this means is that one has to have lived in a particular area to get to the heart. A man with the finest intellect who knows everything about another culture can negotiate in diplomacy, can at times win debates, but to truly get to the heart of somebody, we really need to have somebody who's lived their lives. In a globalizing 21st century world, third culture kids who've lived in one culture and have other different cultures that they identify with are going to be the bridges, the light that binds, guides all the cultures together in this globalizing world. But of course, you, dear audience, are probably thinking now, oh, the third culture kid is the way to live. Moving through different cultures sounds fun, right? Right? Yes. Okay. But I would argue that it's much more complicated than that, and I'm drawing from my own experiences as well as from those third culture kids that I've spoken to. There is this tragedy that one has to overcome when one moves from one country to another, when one leaves behind everything that they've loved and known, their previous schools and their previous lives, they have to all be left behind. I would argue that there are two main ways that one can deal with this particular tragedy. One way is to have some constancy in life. And what I mean by constancy is, for example, for me, it was in my education. There needs to be something that binds you together and holds your identity together. And for me, this was through education, the constancy in my education, which was through 12 rigorous years in the International Baccalaureate, which, for those of you who aren't familiar, is a program that's very similar worldwide and run from Geneva. However, perhaps more importantly than education, because education obviously isn't everything, I would argue that it's the moments in one's life, those beautiful, savoring moments that truly defines a third culture kid. I recall the last time I saw Australia when I waved goodbye to that sunburnt country, smelt the last of that salty air, as I saw the last of Trondheim Cathedral School, as I heard the bells of the beautiful Nidaros Cathedral ringing for the last time. Dear audience, I can talk to you all day about what being a third culture kid in the 21st century really means, but these moments in my life, scattered throughout the continents, is truly what defines who I am, in a sense. It is something that I've thought and rethought over and over again, and I feel that these moments, these savoring moments, are the greatest moments that define who I am. So, when you meet a third culture kid in the meantime, and I guarantee you, if you're watching this video, you most probably have met a third culture kid, or here's one right now you can talk to. Why don't you ask them about their whole journey, about their entire lives, rather than just about where they've been, end of conversation? Because that's what really matters. You see, my accent now, which I've been speaking to you for the last 11 minutes with, is not a place where I shirk back anymore. Rather, it's a sense of pride. It's another souvenir that I've earned from this great journey that I've had. So I've been speaking to you now for 11 minutes, but why don't you meet me later, in another 11 years, let's say, and listen to my accent then, and guess my journey's path. Until then, the IB has asked me to do a lot of rigorous work, so until then I will say, allez.